Welcome to the July 7th update of the coronavirus forecasting model by the IHME, the Institute of Health Metrics and Evaluation from the University of Washington. Through the morning of July 7th, there have been no revisions to the model since June 30th. We will continue to look at the model through August 4th. The projections now have gone into October. One of the things that will be a little bit different is we're going to be taking a look at the infections. We'll take another look at the Kansas and United States mortality statistics. Again, there is going to be a discussion of the distributions of daily death compared to the March 26 model. One of the things we will add this time is we will focus on the 8 persons per million switch point that the IHME has looked at. Essentially, this is the 90th percentile for governments essentially reinstituting stay-at-home orders and some of the more restricted aspects on the economy. And so one of the things we'll take a look at is just where we are from an original perspective. And from an economic perspective, where are we? Are we getting close to where states may institute more economic restrictions? We're going to also look at the cumulative deaths compared to the March 26 model, and so we will take a look at those. We will also update the trend analysis that we reported last time. Again, the coronavirus certainly has had a major effect on the U.S. economy. The unemployment rate is 11%. Since the middle of March, more than 45 million U.S. workers have filed for unemployment. The Institute for Health Metrics and Evaluation at the University of Washington continues to play a large role in the formulation of policy, and a lot of the data that we use in that model comes from there. We also use the COVID tracking project, and we're also using some world meters data this time. Again, it is important really to document and understand the ex-post performance of the model and the revisions that occur periodically. Certainly as governments think about and individuals think about where we are, looking at how accurate those forecasts have been are certainly important. This is an update of the June 30th discussion, and so we will look at this. The model, again, is pretty similar in terms of with no updates. There really haven't been anything. The big thing is they last week added, in terms of what is expected to happen, a situation with mandates continuing to ease and estimates with 95% of the population wearing masks. The threshold they use is 8 per million, and the idea is that and the 8 per million, essentially you would move from a mandates easing to a situation where there would be requirements of mask wearing and also other requirements. The last thing to realize is the paper still is in the peer review process. One of the things we took a look at, and this is from the Worldometer's website, is basically looking at what percentage of the population has been infected. And so if you look at the U.S., the average is 0.93%, roughly less than 1%. 1% infection rate would basically indicate that one individual per 100 is infected. In terms of, there is some argument that certainly not all infections are tested and identified for, and so certainly the infection rate could be greater than the 0.93% or the 1% rate. In terms of, for example, if you would double or triple it, it would be 2 or 3%, and so it does give you a little bit of an indication. In terms of looking at this, we have the state-by-state basis. What I ended up doing here is look at this on a state-by-state basis using the July 7th Worldometer's data. In terms of looking at it, the range is from Hawaii with an infection rate of 0.08%. to New York, where essentially there would be 2.18% of the individuals affected. The other state that is close to the 2% rate is New Jersey. And so if you think about it there, in New Jersey and New York, essentially you're looking at about 1 out of 50 infected. In terms of in Hawaii, essentially you would be looking at about 1 out of 1,000 infected. And so you can see certainly a wide range. One of the things you can look at is certainly in terms of if we circle some of these, you can see the numbers being greater than 1. Also, you can kind of look at the patterns of red, and so you have Rhode Island, New York, essentially New Jersey, Maryland, a lot of Northeast Connecticut and Delaware are there. In terms of, there has been concern about Arizona. Florida just hit the 1% rate. In terms of Illinois is 1.2. Iowa is over 1. Nebraska is over 1, and so you do have some of the Midwest there. And so you can see some patterns with regards to where they are. To maybe summarize, the U.S. infection rate overall is 0.93%, less than that 1%. The state range of infection rates is the high of 2.18% in New York to 0.08% for Hawaii. 14 of the states have had an infection rate greater than 1%, and that remains results in 36 states having an infection rate of less than 1%. And so that gives a little bit of an indication with regards to the infection rates. This slide here is just an update of the slides that we've been looking at for the last few weeks. One of the things in terms of if you look at Kansas, essentially you see that COVID affects the older population a little bit more heavily in terms of mortality than all diseases as a whole, in terms of essentially all but the 75 to 84 are higher than that. If we look at the U.S., essentially a little bit different than Kansas in terms of the cutoff there is roughly at 65, and so you'll see that the mortality rates for COVID are a little bit higher than the 2017 mortality rates for the U.S. In terms of, again, you look at this and you see very low death rates in the younger populations. And those are even lower than the typical mortality rates for that population base in terms of the distribution. If we look at the actual deaths in terms of for Kansas, essentially you have the deaths per 1,000 in this category. In terms of looking at, for example, 1.54 deaths per 1,000, basically that would mean that less than 0.2% of individuals 85 years and older have died from the COVID. And so looking at that, basically it would say 1 out of 500 individuals 85 years and older have died because of the coronavirus. Again, you can compare these with the annual rates, and normally in a year, in Kansas we're looking at 14.2% of those 85 and above that end up dying. We have the same numbers for the U.S. One of the things with regards to the U.S. is you see that the death rates per 1,000 are higher than what we've experienced in Kansas, and so certainly that is a positive effect. Last week we introduced the aspect of trend, and so what we ended up doing is estimating a trend by a daily basis. Last week we looked at essentially the period June 1 to June 29th. What we ended up doing is just adding another 7 days onto that, and so we essentially increased the observations by about 25% just to see whether or not there has been a change over the last week with regards to that. In some cases, for example, the trend basically became less negative or actually increased, and so you'll have observations there. And in other cases, it's went the other way. New Jersey is an outlier, and we'll kind of show you why it is when we look at some daily death rates. Again, in terms of looking at this, how to interpret this, basically what this says for Illinois as an example is as each day passes, there is 2.4 less deaths in Illinois than there was the day before. And so again, there's a lot of variability around that, but again, as days pass, essentially there's 2.4. And so over 10 days, there'd be 24. Essentially, we're looking a little bit more than a 30-day period. And so essentially, you could basically look at about 80 deaths less per day now than what we were experiencing at the beginning of June. And so you can begin to look at this. One of the things you end up seeing here is that there are a number of states with negative. Basically, we're still on a decreasing trend. Certainly some of those trends may be getting closer and closer to zero as the number of deaths get closer and closer to zero by a state perspective. In terms of on the increases, certainly you see an increase in Arizona, but again, the increase actually decreased from last week. One of the big switches was Florida. Last week they were over the previous 4 weeks seeing a decreasing trend. This week that trend has actually switched to increase. Again, you can look at some of the other states there in order to take a look at it. But I think the key thing to draw from this, while Texas is increasing, a lot of the states are having a no positive trend, and several states are having negative trends with regards to the daily death rates. And so, again, seeing the numbers in red with a negative trend there is a good thing, basically indicating that we're seeing less deaths on a statewide basis. To summarize, there's 30 states that have had a decrease from June 1 to July 6th. 14 states have had an increase, and then there's 6 states basically that are less than 0.01. The U.S. is actually seeing 10 less deaths per day since June 1. If you look at this roughly being a 35-day period, and round that up to 10, essentially, on June 1, there were 350 more deaths per day than on June 6th, or July 6th, and so certainly that is a positive. Last week that number was about 5, and again, part of that was just from a data reporting, and again, it just shows some of the sensitivity analysis with that regard in terms of, we'll see in pictures here in terms of how that looks. And so essentially what we had is essentially last week or the week before, there was a big spike in New Jersey deaths. They went back and attributed some deaths to COVID, and those spiked all in one day. It did affect the U.S. numbers. Certainly, if you kind of look at that, you can see that there is a downward trend from essentially the window that we estimated, which was essentially June 1 to July 6th. And so that's there. The pink line is one of the things we added, and this is basically, we take the population from each state and the U.S. as a whole. We divide that into millions, and so essentially there's 8 persons per million there. And so essentially if you multiply the 8 per million, which IHME is using as their threshold for reinstituting more severe economic slowdowns and essentially moving more back to a stay-at home as we were in April and May and some of March. Certainly this ends up being about 2,600, and so if you multiply the 8 times the U.S. population, that pink line is. One of the things that's very important to look at is basically just the difference between the pink line and the red line. And so as the U.S. as a whole, certainly there seems to be a better experience with regards to the mortality rate. We're not seeing quite as high a rate, or quite a bit lower rate. In terms of, if you look at that, there were only 2 days where we actually increased that 8 per million threshold. And so whether or not that's 9 or whether or not it's 7, the big thing is even though we are having an uptick in the number of cases, the outcomes are such that they're quite a bit below that 8 million threshold. And so if you would look at this, essentially you would probably see that we're probably about 10-15% of that threshold. If you look at different states, and you're going to see a recurring pattern here. Kansas has never reached the 8 per million threshold. Colorado is quite a bit away. Essentially, they're about 50% of the threshold. In terms of Nebraska, they did have 1 day there, and it could be a reporting thing in terms of if you look close to that where they have a big number and then something really close to 0, they may end up having 2 reporting. But if you look kind of over the last couple of weeks, essentially, they're about 1/3 of that 8 per million. Again, Missouri's below. Oklahoma's quite a bit below. In terms of New York, essentially early on, they were well above the 8 per million deaths per day, and now just a lot of space there, and so you can see the improving picture. This is the New Jersey. Certainly these reported deaths should be spread out over the case. In terms of looking at this, you can end up seeing that they're there. In terms of, if you look, they're pretty close to that, and so in some respects they're there. The other thing is you have this green and purple line. The green is the original bounds, 95% confidence interval. Basically, that would say there's a 95% probability that you would be between those 2 lines. The purple line is the mean. One of the things you can see, obviously, in New Jersey, the experience was quite a bit worse than what was projected. And while it has improved, again, it's pretty close to that threshold that the IHME uses. Connecticut, in terms of over the last periods, essentially continued improvement. Massachusetts, in some respects, is fairly close to that threshold, a much different experience, and for a long period of time here, they were above the 8 deaths per million. Maryland has established quite a bit of a gap there, and so certainly they've seen an improving picture. Delaware has a lot of gap there. Rhode Island less so, and so if you look at their threshold, certainly they've experienced more deaths. Again, there is some variability there, but certainly Rhode Island, if you would use that 8 per million with regards to a threshold, they're there. New Hampshire certainly had one observation here recently, but if you look at the bulk of the situation, they're in a pretty good place. Vermont has always been in a good place, quite a bit below that 8 per million. Maine, Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan, you're seeing a recurring theme here. Indiana, Illinois, in terms of maybe 2-3 weeks ago, there were some closeness to the threshold, but over the last 2 weeks, they've seen quite a bit better picture. Iowa, a better picture. Minnesota, a better picture. Wisconsin, a better picture. Florida, certainly Florida is quite a bit below the threshold that they had indicated, at least from the death rate, if that's the metric you end up using, although you can end up seeing that there is a slight uptick in the deaths over time. Georgia has seen a better picture. South Carolina, actually, while there is some room there, it does appear that they're kind of on an upward trend here. North Dakota, or North Carolina quite a bit, Virginia quite a bit, West Virginia quite a bit, Kentucky quite a bit, Tennessee quite a bit, Alabama, quite a bit of room. Less so in Mississippi, in terms of Mississippi is a little bit closer. Louisiana, quite a bit of space. Arkansas, quite a bit of space. Texas, again, looking at that, quite a bit of better experience than that 8 million in terms of if you get at the 8 deaths per million. In Texas, you'd be looking at about 230 deaths per day, and they've not been close to that. New Mexico, a better picture. In some respects, this is more disconcerting in Arizona, and certainly they've had experience. Again, you do have to be a little careful with regards to the reporting. Certainly there is some lumpiness there, and again, if you would average those, they might be below, but again, there's not as much space between the actual experience and the 8 deaths per million. Utah in good shape, Wyoming in good shape, Montana in good shape. North Dakota certainly had a situation where there were 11 deaths reported in the last week. However, before and after there were 0, and so if you divide that by 4 days, essentially you would see that down around 4. And so again, it's just the difficulty of looking at the South Dakota, quite a bit of space. Moving on to Idaho, a good situation. Nevada, a good situation. California, quite a bit below that threshold that the IHME uses for instituting more economic restrictions and restrictions on movement. Oregon, quite a bit below. Washington, quite a bit below. Alaska, quite a bit below. And Hawaii, quite a bit below. And so you do see a lot of patterns there where most are in pretty good shape. We're not going to show you the cumulative death projections. If you want to take a look at those, they're in the PDF and the agmanager.info, and so you can look at that and look at each state. Essentially, in terms of looking at this, essentially there are 12 states above the mean and above the 95% confidence interval. And then there's 13 states that are below the mean and below the 95% confidence interval. If you add that together, roughly 25 out of the 50 states are outside the 5% confidence interval. That's roughly 50%, and that's about 10 times more than what would be expected in terms of with the projections from the March 26 model. Certainly in terms of with a 5% confidence interval, you would expect roughly 5% or 5% of the states to be outside of that. That would be 2.5 states, but essentially we're seeing 25, and so about 10% more. And then if you look at this in terms of there's 25% that are within the 25% confidence interval. If we add the 12 and the 6, basically 18 states have experienced the cumulative death situation worse than what was originally projected. And essentially, if you would add the 19 plus the 13, 32 states are below the mean. And so what that means is the model, when it was projected on March 26th, in terms of there does seem to be a little bit of, on a state-by-state basis, where the model over-predicted the number of deaths, and the distribution was much broader than maybe that normal distribution you would normally see. But again, it does give a little bit of a summarization there that is important to think about. So to maybe conclude, in terms of the distribution of death continues to be similar to the distribution of death for all causes. Again, while the deaths, and every death is difficult and not desired, the death rate has been improving. If you look at the overall infection rate, one of the ways to think about it, using the numbers through July 7th, essentially we're looking at about 1% of the U.S. population has been infected. And again, there's certainly some error around that number just because of how they're measuring. Since June 1, the U.S. as a whole has basically seen 10 less deaths per day. And so if you multiply that out by roughly 35 days, essentially you're 350 deaths. And so the trend analysis basically says that over that 35-day period, we've improved the situation by a reduction of 350 deaths or 10 deaths per day. Again, using the 8 deaths per million as an indicator for economic shutdown. And so basically this is indicating when governments may institute more restrictions on the economy, on movement of individuals, basically using that as 8 deaths per million. There's really only about 7 states that are relatively close or above that metric over the last couple weeks. And so again, from an economic perspective, if you're using death as a metric, that daily death metric, essentially we're doing pretty good as a country. In terms of looking at this, 30 states have had a decreasing trend for daily deaths. 14 have experienced an increasing trend. And so, again, you see that many states are on a pattern that is having that decreasing trend for deaths. I think it also is important to realize that there are many states where the death rate on a daily basis, or the number of deaths on a daily basis, is approaching 0. In terms of looking at the cumulative death total, if you look at the mean for the U.S., essentially we're above the mean, but within that 95% confidence band. And so essentially what this tends to indicate is, while on a state-by-state basis there's probably a wider distribution than you would like, the U.S., in some respects, that original model is pretty well within that confidence interval, and while it is a little bit better or above the mean, certainly you would like to see it be below the mean, but it is in the 95% confidence interval. And so if you do look at some of the projections and some of the thoughts, it probably doesn't do too bad on a U.S. basis. Perhaps it doesn't do so well on a state-by-state basis. And again, just because of the disaggregation, it's much more difficult to model at a state-by-state basis than it is the U.S. as a whole. One of the things we hope to take a look at in the upcoming couple weeks is basically really look at what is the forecast error, and how long are these forecasts quality before they begin to degrade. And certainly we did a little bit of that early on, and we'll come back and look at how these updates on the projections, if they continue to do well, or if they don't do so well with regards to projection error or forecast error. With that, have a good week, have a good rest of the day, and hopefully this information has been useful for you as you think through how society is dealing with the coronavirus.